Greetings and welcome back to the Casual Wargamer. Today, I thought we could do a little bit of a lore chat discussion type thing with regards to the gods of chaos and how they've kind of changed a little bit in the last 40 years with regards to Warhammer 40k. Originally, the gods of chaos in general, were not a part of Warhammer 40k. The Rogue Trader game, first edition, didn't get them until over a year after its release. At which point, over the next 2 years, we got two books called The Realms of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness and Lost in the Damned. Two books obviously written by two very different teams of authors because they were rather different in approach and artwork and generally everything. It's almost like two separate books, but that's a different topic. And book one was Khorne and Slaanesh, and book two was Tzeentch and Nurgle. Khorne is the god of bloodshed, violence, murder, kill, maim, burn, skulls for the skull throne, all that sort of good stuff. For me, a very two-dimensional chaos god. Sorry, Khorne fans. And Khorne is basically the driving force behind pretty much everything in the 40k universe. After all, this constant fighting, warfare, and so forth is basically just empowering him. Some people will tell you that Khorne is the god of honourable combat, and I really don't know where they're getting this from. Maybe in Warhammer Fantasy back in the day, but in 40k he is certainly anything but. Khorne just isn't. I mean, it's just berserk slaughter is what Khorne represents. It's the pleasure derived from the killing of a foe, putting your chain axe through his skull and showing that you are the better warrior, but in a very bloodthirsty and brutal manner. Nothing honourable about Khorne in the slightest. Slaanesh, on the other hand, is the hermaphroditic dark prince of pleasure and excess. And unlike Khorne, Slaanesh has undergone a bit of a change over the decades. Originally, Slaanesh in the 80s was very, very much the whole pleasure and pain sexual element. There's a reason that if you look at the old Rogue Trader era models, they were in kind of bondage gear with breasts hanging out and worse. That was very much what they were going for, and it was kind of aimed at an adult market. I certainly think it was down to the fact that Warhammer Fantasy and in general at the time, Games Workshop products were aimed towards a more mature audience. But that started to change, and the whole reason for that is that Games Workshop wanted to start drawing in new blood, and they wanted to aim for the teens and sort of like people, kids of like 9 or 10 upwards. And the last thing mummy and daddy want is to go looking at the army that their kid wants to see breasts flopping around and other unmentionable bits on display. So Slaanesh was toned down to be the god of excess and pleasure. So the sexual stuff is still there, but it's very much swept under the carpet. It's more sort of like, I'd even say, drugs and whatever esoteric pleasures you're involved in. It's never really explained what. It's sensation now rather than the excesses of the flesh or the mind. And it's all been done just to make Warhammer a little bit more kid-friendly. There are obviously a lot of Slaanesh fans who do not follow that particular thing. But, Games Workshop have got to do what Games Workshop's got to do. if they wanted to bring bring the younger people in, they've got to do something to make it a little bit more palatable to the general public. Now, Khorne and Slaanesh are very much rivals. They've always been described as such, but the reason for that simply is the generation of pleasure. Khorne and his followers generate pleasure from the slaughter of innocents and the enemy on the battlefield, whereas Slaanesh and their followers are very much derived pleasure from other means, not necessarily as violent. And in the original Realms of Chaos books, it was kind of put this was the cause of their rivalry. They both generate or they both receive pleasure from two very different and opposing things. Tzeentch and Nurgle, okay, are a little bit of an odd couple because they're rivals too. But realistically, as they are presented now, that rivalry doesn't mean anything. And that's because of what they originally represented. Nurgle is very much the god of pestilence, plague, disease, flies, rot, all that unpleasantness. Essentially, a kind of devolution. You weren't killed in some unpleasant and unnatural manner, as you might do under the administrations of Khorne or Slaanesh, but you would rot, you would decompose, you'd be alive the whole time and screaming in pain and panic unless you gave yourself over to Nurgle. But Nurgle's also got this weird thing about being the god of rebirth as well. Rot leads to new life, fungus, bugs, creepy crawlies. So Nurgle's a very odd one in that for me. But Nurgle's whole thing really was almost like the fear of death, and the fear of becoming sick. And so you would turn to Nurgle in order to avoid this. And you would basically take on all the diseases in the universe and anything else that he came up with, because that way he's got you. Because the moment you turn and go, actually, Nurgle, not interested, you are afflicted by everything, and it becomes exceedingly unpleasant. Tzeentch, on the other hand, originally, well, I'm not going to go into the original bit. Tzeentch now, I would say, is very much the god of power, ambition, drive, becoming what you want, and the consequences and the means of doing it be damned, and in doing so you become damned. You know, it's all it's the sorcery element, it's the, as you see with the likes of Ahriman or whatnot, it's becoming, it's that drive, that ambition, as I'm saying, it's to increase your social standing, your wealth, your political power. Tzeentch is all very much sort of like this. It's all about having that power over other people and what you're willing to do to achieve it. Well, Tzeentch was never that originally. Tzeentch was still the god of sorcery and magic, but back in the day, in the early days, Tzeentch and Nurgle were opposed because Nurgle was the devolution. You rotted, you became nothing. And Tzeentch was the god of evolution, mutation, and change. That's why he's called the Changer of the Ways. And his followers would mutate. They would gain extra arms, wings, horns, eyes, whatever. It was all about evolution through mutation, taken to an extreme. And that's why they didn't get along. But Tzeentch seemed to have lost that whole mutation element in order to be this god of magic and ambition, drive. To the point now that I would say that Tzeentch and Nurgle are not really opposed, other than being one of the four Chaos gods, and where their machinations interact. The whole thing for those two being opposed just doesn't exist anymore. In fact, I would say that Tzeentch is more opposed with Khorne, because Khorne doesn't like magic. Magic is the coward's way out. But that rarely ever gets raised anymore. Now, that's our 4 Chaos Gods. But you might have heard of another one called Malal or Malice, as he occasionally gets referenced. And this is an awkward one. You'll see that there are people out there who I think there is a warband of Chaos Marines renegades called the Sons of Malice or something like that. And Malice Malal originally came from early Warhammer Fantasy, and he was a Chaos God that basically was opposed to the Chaos Gods, and he fought against them. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. I don't really understand much of the lore behind him. But ultimately, he got shunted because I can't remember whether he appeared in sort of like early Warhammer comics or what have you. But Malal was a copyright owned by somebody else, and I don't know the exact details, but they sort of like left the good graces of Games Workshop, and at which point Games Workshop basically had to ditch the inclusion of Malal. In fact, I think the only time I've ever seen him really mentioned was in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay rulebook, where there was only 3 Chaos Gods mentioned: Khorne, Nurgle, and Malal. Now, I think the name Malice was brought in an attempt to sort of have this lesser Chaos God, but they've never really done anything with him. The other one we have up and coming is obviously Vashtor the Archifane, as the god of artifice and the drive to invent, which is very odd for a Chaos God. It doesn't really fit to me. Certainly as a patron for Dark Mechanicum, he could be there, and I am surprised that he's in the CSM book when I would imagine if we ever get a Dark Mechanicus book, he would be with them. I'm not really sure whether, I mean, you'll never see Vashtor rise up to that level within the confines of 40k. He's very much, I think, just a new addition to the model range and a cool character, even if he doesn't particularly add up on the tabletop very well. It's interesting, though, that they are trying to bring in a potential another deity, though. If they were going to do it, though, I wouldn't have done it based on kind of like the warped technology aspect. That always seems a little bit odd to me. But that is your Chaos Gods, and how they have changed a little bit. Khorne and Nurgle not so much, Slaanesh and Tzeentch very much so, and the potential of 2 others. That one technically no longer exists, but sort of does in the background, and the other one that we have up and coming. If I had to choose, back in the day, in the days of Rogue Trader and what have you, when the game kicked off, Tzeentch was actually my favourite. I really liked the concept behind Tzeentch at the time. Now, I do like Slaanesh, and I do ponder the idea of when they do an Emperor's Children Codex, whether I go for an Emperor's Children army or not. Depends what they do with it. But I like Nurgle, and I really like Death Guard, and I don't know, there's just some cool mental imagery that goes through the brain when I think of Nurgle and his forces attacking an Imperial world or what have you. But Khorne, as I said earlier, I think is very two-dimensional, and Tzeentch I actually find quite boring now as a concept. But there you go. But which is your favourite Chaos God? Are they one that you play an army for? If not, why not? And if so, why? What made you pick them? Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope it has been a little bit of interest. Until next time, guys, good gaming. One last thing, give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and let me know if you have any topics you would like me to cover. Until then, take care.